Thank you for joining us in Finding God in the World of Video Games, and in today's Rewind, we're taking a look at a couple of the opportunities that we've had to fit into the red and gold armor-plated shoes of Iron Man, whether that's the Iron Man VR title that released earlier this summer, or maybe Marvel's Avengers that came out this September. Now, in either of these games, you may not get to enjoy the wealth, the socializing, and the let's just say other infamous pursuits of the world's greatest genius billionaire playboy philanthropist. But the opportunity to take on at least the armor-clad portion of Tony Stark's personality has been something I'm sure most of us have longed to do ever since we first watched Tony take to the skies. And if you've watched any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, and I'm assuming if you're watching this, you probably have watched one or two, I will tell you that from this point forward, there may be some spoilers, especially as it relates to Avengers Endgame. So if for some reason you haven't had a chance to watch that yet, maybe go do that for the next about 3 hours. It's a good use of your time. You won't regret it. And then come back and see me. For the rest of us, it should be safe to move about the cabin of Iron Man's final flight. So the closure of the Iron Man story arc, for me, may be the single most important story thread that was weaved in and out of Marvel's magnum opus, and we're going to take some time to absorb and reflect on it, and with any luck, learn a few things about ourselves as well. So let's start with understanding just who Tony Stark, the invincible Iron Man, truly is, or at least what he used to be. By his own definition, he was a genius. He was a billionaire. He was certainly a playboy and a philanthropist, and he definitely lived up to his billing in each of these areas. When we first find Tony, he is blissfully and willfully ignorant of not only the true source of his wealth, but of his destiny as well. The enormous riches and social status he inherited as a legacy from his genius father unfortunately came with a bullseye squarely on his chest, and his enemies rapidly began leaping out of the woodwork to lay claim to what he possesses, but in their view, he has not yet truly earned. Tony, who's ever the one to somehow magically make oranges out of lemonade, took on each foe one by one, and through their attacks, he created and perfected his crowning achievement, the Iron Man armor. His new mission in life, as well as his heroic alter ego, was born within the crucible of his enemy's wrath. Now, before we go much further, there is an actual real-world inspiration for the fictional character of Tony Stark. Surprised? Shocked? Constipated? Mildly interested? Well, hopefully not the constipated. That has nothing to do with what's happening here. You might want to see a doctor. But I'm hoping the last one is true, because the original genius billionaire playboy philanthropist was none other than, wait for it, King Solomon. He was the richest, wisest, most powerful man to ever walk the earth. But don't take my word for it. Just check out his entrance onto the grand stage in 2 Chronicles. You look in chapter 1, and we'll skip around to a couple verses here, but God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, you've shown great mercy to David, my father, and you've made me king. Now, I would like to have wisdom and knowledge, that I may go out and come in before these people, because who can judge this great people of yours? And God said to Solomon, because this was in your heart, you've not asked riches or wealth or honor or the life of your enemies, or even long life. You asked for wisdom and knowledge, so I am going to grant that to you, and I'm going to give you riches and wealth and honor such as none of the kings who have had before you, nor shall any after you have the like. The richest man to ever live, the wisest human to ever be born, more honor than anyone before or after him. So that's genius, that's billionaire, that's philanthropist. What are we missing here? Oh yes, that's right. Solomon also lives up to Tony in his, let's just say his less virtuous pursuits. Solomon had 700 wives and an additional 300 concubines. So I would say he probably had the playboy part of this nailed down as well. So now we have two very gifted men with the intention of using all of these incredible gifts provided to them to lead, to protect, and to govern those that they feel they have a responsibility for. Now let's see where their paths take them. Let's start with Tony. With his new power, Tony began the transition from a man who had only used his capabilities for his own selfish gratification into someone who felt compelled to help others. But there's one fairly large problem. Tony was still not only his own worst enemy, but the general public's as well. Now, you might say that's harsh criticism, but let's see. Tony believed he was the only one capable of truly protecting the planet, so he took it upon himself to create the Ultron entity in the Age of Ultron. Ultron was intended to be a suit of armor around the world, but due to the inherent flaws of his creator, he decided to destroy the planet instead. The end result was Tony had inadvertently caused a great deal of death and pain until he finally solved this disaster of his own design with the help of a few powerful friends. Tony was so bent on doing things his way, even after the abject failure of the Ultron project, he created this entire story arc that came out in the Civil War, where he splintered the Avengers and left them weak enough to eventually be manipulated and defeated by Thanos as we got into the Infinity War saga. Now, perhaps you may see him as having his heart in the right place, but maybe he's just a tad bit out of his league. Well, Solomon was also very much the same man, just several thousand years prior and actually real. He started out well, he exercised exceptional judgment with his people, and he completed his father David's passion project by building the Temple of God in Jerusalem, a project which took 7 years. But then, sadly, we begin to see the priorities for Solomon shift as he decides to build a palace for himself, a project which took 13 years. Placing almost twice as much effort and time into erecting a monument for his own glory as he did for the living God. In 1 Kings 11, Solomon finally has his heart fully turned away from the righteous path he had originally set out on, as he builds beautiful and impressive places of worship for all of his many wives to worship their idolatrous false gods. Because of his foolish pride in thinking he could serve the Lord on his own terms while actively disobeying him, Solomon placed not only himself, but his entire nation under the consequences of sin. The kingdom would be split in two, civil war, following Solomon's death, and would never be the same again due to the folly of Solomon's careless actions. So we have two genius billionaire playboy philanthropists whose choices placed them on a path that divided their respective kingdoms and left them in a state of weakness. Both had a myriad of good intentions, but their massive hubris got in the way and placed them and those who depended on them on the brink of disaster. Now, fortunately, here's where their two paths diverge, and we see how each informs us a little bit about ourselves as well. Now, I believe many, if not all of us, would love to have just one of the gifts that God bestowed on Solomon, much less all of the incredible blessings he received, and who wouldn't want to walk a mile in Tony Stark's arc reactor-powered shoes? One would think that with all of this wisdom, as well as the incredible advantages of both of their gifted family legacies, that would be a recipe for success. Many times I know I have been guilty of believing that if I only had more money, maybe a more advantaged birth, or been gifted with a superior intellect or other physical gifts, maybe my life would have turned out differently, or better. But both of these examples, fact and fiction, clearly demonstrate the reality that our environment is not responsible for who we become. It is our choices of how we choose to use the gifts God has given us. Whether these gifts seem large and visible, or small and seemingly inconsequential, the truth is that the size of our God-given talents has no bearing on the path we take in life. We are ultimately, we're the architects of our own destiny or demise, and Tony and Solomon both take very different paths to their respective endgames. So let's start with our real-world friend, King Solomon. In his final days, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, his final account of a life lived with every advantage, all the wisdom, the money, the power, the women, the accomplishments. And here's where he ends up. In Ecclesiastes 2, verses 9 through 11. I became great and excelled more than all who were before me. My wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. My heart rejoiced in my labor, and this was my reward. I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and it was all vanity, grasping for the wind. There was no profit. At the end of a life many would consider incredibly privileged and well-lived, Solomon realized he had missed the point in his life. All his hard work, his many gifts and accomplishments, But in the end, he felt all of it was for nothing. He had no legacy. His kingdom would be inherited by his son, who would go on to make unwise choices and lose all he had worked so hard to gain, and that would continue with his progeny after him. This is where Tony Stark diverges from the path of the wisest man who ever truly lived, realizing that the legacy he can leave through sacrificing himself would be more rewarding than anything he could gratify himself with. In the finale of Avengers Endgame, Tony makes the ultimate sacrifice, one that he would have never made at the beginning of his journey. His desire to leave a life and a legacy for his wife, his daughter, and all of the lives of those he had finally grown to love and appreciate more than his own selfish pursuits finally overrode his ego and ambition. He saw his gifts for what they were intended to be, an opportunity to benefit others, not himself. And with his final sacrifice, he finally became the noble protector he had always envisioned himself to be, inspiring others to follow in his stead. So now for us, you and I, we may not have any of the gifts that Solomon or Tony were blessed with, but every one of us were given unique gifts from God to use in this life for the benefit of others. They may not seem as glamorous as we may have wanted, and they may not be the gifts we would have chosen if we could pick them from a list. They are what we are meant to use in this life to benefit, inspire, and build others. We are the caretakers of a calling that may reach many or few, but we don't choose the location or the size of our mission, only if, when, and how willingly we choose to complete it. I want to encourage you today that no matter what gifts or blessings you have been given, or wish you had been given, you are armed with everything you need to do what you have been placed on this earth to do. No matter what foolish decisions or mistakes you may have made, God has not changed his mind about you. He gave you those gifts and your calling knowing every choice you would make in your life well in advance. You are still on course to fulfill all he has placed before you, and your legacy will be cemented by what you do from this point forward, not what lies in your past. Tony Stark didn't spend time looking back at his life, wondering if he had wasted it. He chose to look forward and ensure he completed his path no matter what the cost to himself. He became the suit of armor around the world that he thought he was supposed to build. And you will be the tangible hands of God in someone else's story. And all of your gifts, great or small, and everything you need to be who you were born to be, it's already in you. If you're wondering what you should do, just ask yourself this: what would Iron Man